Talokalava, Maluelele, Bulabinaka, and Kia ora tata katoa. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here. I hope that what I can do is follow on from Jim's look at the science to take us through to the policy. I just would like to make one disclaimer. I'm listed in this schedule as climate negotiator. I'd like to formally withdraw that label because I think the appropriate action for climate negotiators, despite the Paris Agreement, is to hang their heads in shame, largely. Just to give you an example, Great Paris Agreement we all know, so guess what happens at the first major meeting after the Paris Agreement? We normally have the big climate meetings at the end of the year, and then halfway through the year there's what they call the intersessional meeting, where you're supposed to get stuck into the work. Well, there was a 2-week meeting in Bonn, and guess what they did for the first week, these climate negotiators? They argued about the agenda, so no work got done. That's unfortunately par for the course. Anyway, so I'm no longer a climate negotiator.
Change it to climate ambassador.
Former negotiator. Okay. So what I'd like to do, I thought, in basically three sections briefly. One, to talk about what I call the changed context coming from the Paris Agreement, so international, but also what that means for us at home. And my view is that it was a big shift, and my view also is that there is a shift taking place at home. But the point about these shifts is that they don't just suddenly happen. It's not suddenly from A to B. If you've got a shift, there's always this remnants. You know, this was a heavily negotiated shift, and there's always remnants of the past there, and there's elements of the future. So I see us in a sort of a transition period, but I'm certainly more optimistic than I was a year or two ago. Secondly, just a few comments on the role that the church or faiths have played up until now. And then thirdly, some of my own views on where would be the most effective ways for churches to be engaged from now on. So just starting with the Paris Agreement, I brought a copy along. You only need to, and I certainly wouldn't recommend reading any UNFCCC document, but you only need to read 2 parts of this Paris Agreement, and they're both actually readable. One is the preamble, which is basically, at the beginning it's about 15 or so articles, and the second one is Article 2, where the essence of this thing is embodied. So what's new about the Paris Agreement? Firstly, this is a long-term agreement. It doesn't have to be renegotiated every few years, hopefully. The agreement does involve contributions from countries which are supposed to be renewed every so often, but you can do that without having to go back and renegotiate the whole thing. So it's a result of 10 years work, 10 years negotiation, starting in 2005, when we had to renegotiate the Kyoto Protocol, and we added in this other element, which was the broader negotiation, so that's fine. Secondly, this is now universal. By universal, I mean that all countries now are committed to take action and put forward their actions. The new word they use now is contribution, that's just for negotiating reasons, but all countries are expected to put forward contributions. That's a fundamental shift from Kyoto, which only had commitments for effectively the OECD countries, and of course the major emitting developing countries did not have any obligations to put in commitments, so that's changed. Thirdly, and this comes back I think to the science, the aim has actually become a lot clearer, and that's thanks to some excellent work I think by the scientists trying to make their findings more clear to policy people. When I'm lecturing on climate change, I often use a quote to illustrate the importance of making things simple, because it is, as some have seen, diabolically complicated. And the quote is from a guy who died about 3 or 4 years ago, Mikhail Kalashnikov. Now, you might not admire what his product actually does, but no one can deny its incredible efficiency. It can work in humidity, it can work in deserts, used by everyone from, you know, legitimate armies to terrorists. And he was asked, not long before his death, what's the secret of this, you know, of this product? And he said, everything that is necessary in that rifle is simple. Everything that is necessary is simple. And I think that this concept that Jim mentioned of the carbon budget, that has been a very useful simplification. The challenge is there. What the carbon budget means is that at a certain point, you have to stop emitting CO2. Let's just talk about CO2. You've got to stop emitting CO2, or if you are emitting it, you need to capture some of it or do negative emissions. So what that does, that implies a global transition. In its simplest form, it implies a global transition away from fossil fuels. And that's absolutely the essence of it. And so when you take back the implications of that to an individual country, then the fundamental conclusion is, yeah, it's about, we're New Zealand, so what's our transition away from fossil fuels? And I think that's a much more helpful framing than the previous, what I call the Kyoto framing, which is, how much are you going to do? What's your it's like the annual Red Cross fair. You know, how much are you giving this year? How much are you going to do by 2020? How much by 2030? How many tonnes of CO2? Actually, much more fundamental question is becoming, what's your long-term transition plan to get to net zero? Just another couple of things about Paris. It was other actors, non-government actors, had much more influence. The private sector, we had some iconic heads of private sector companies, Jack Ma from Alibaba, from Asia, Paul Paulson from Unilever, and there was a whole day on private sector, and they had the same message, which was, we get it, now we need governments to step up. And you had a very similar message coming from local government, who are, of course, much closer to the adaptation issue. They're looking already at what do we do with our building standards. We've got sea level rise to cope with, increased rainfalls, drainage, etc. Local government message, we had that the mayors of major cities for a whole day, very much a similar message to governments. And I think also I would say that there was a much better bringing this back to the Pacific. Article 2, for some reason, is always a fundamental article. If you look at the Climate Change Convention, it's Article 2. Now, Article 2 in the Paris Agreement is very interesting because, like the Convention, it talks first about, you know, the need to reduce emissions, limit temperature below 2 degrees, etc., etc. Okay, that's what they call mitigation, limiting emissions. But it's got two other paragraphs which make these two things co-equal. One is adaptation. I mean, of course, that is for all the island states, adaptation is an immediate and pressing need. That has got more recognition than it had previously. And thirdly, finance. That there's an awful lot of money needed to flow to these poorer countries to deal with not only adaptation but also mitigation. So that you've got those three things co-equal. And it's really important, I think. This is the the definitive international statement of the challenge. We've got the 2 degrees or 1.5. We've got mitigation, reducing emissions, adaptation, finance. And also in Article 2, I think of interest to civil society groups is the concept of equity is really important here. This agreement will be implemented to reflect equity, etc. So that's the shift. The transition idea, the equality of adaptation and finance. And if you look at, interesting looking at the preamble, you see a lot of influence, more influence from civil society, I think, than has ever been before, if you read through some of the concepts there. I'll get onto that in a second when I talk about the role of the church, but just coming back to New Zealand. So I think that the implications for the Paris Agreement for New Zealand are a real shift to what we do at home and a real shift to that longer term transition, as I said. And it's interesting that I think since the new minister has come into power, into her job, and particularly since she went to New York for signing of the Paris Agreement and mixed and mingled with all the climate glitterati, there's been a real shift in the government narrative. The government narrative was, for about 6 years, has not said very much. It's been very focused on, we're doing our bit, we've got the emissions trading scheme, we're feeding the world through agriculture, and it's all very costly, etc., etc. But there's been, if you've listened to what Paula Bennett has said, there has been quite a shift. She's starting to talk herself about long-term transition to low carbon. We need to have, admitting that the ETS has been pretty ineffective, it hasn't had a decent price on carbon. She's just set up 3 groups to start looking seriously at stuff. One is on agriculture. There's a whole lot of people from the sector looking at sort of low emissions pathways for agriculture, I guess. One on forestry, and then there's another group formed on adaptation. So that's a sign, I think, that there is a shift in government thinking, and of course the ratification of the Paris Agreement. I would say that yes, there's a reputational aspect to that and a sign of commitment, but there's also a very practical reason for ratifying the Paris Agreement, and that is because of the way we've structured our commitment. 2 things are really important to us, and one is the rules applying on forestry, and the other is having an international carbon market that we can access, because it's considered that it'd be too expensive to meet our commitments at home. And they realised that, hang on, if we're not party to this agreement, we're not going to have any say in those rules. So there was a very good self-interest reason for ratifying Paris. So there we are. I'm reasonably optimistic myself. I think there is some new thinking and new commitment. I do think that the Paris Agreement, the virtue of that is that it has engendered changes in attitudes domestically, which is where it needs to happen. As for the churches, I think that the churches, amongst other groups, have had a significant influence here in creating this climate that allowed Paris to get through. And it's you are very much in touch with the poor and most vulnerable, not only countries like the Pacific, but also sectors of society. And if you were at the Paris conference, you would have heard, and this is the first time, usually the small island states go away bitterly disappointed. They've been demanding more action, they've been demanding greater commitment from the developed countries, and in the end, they just get squeezed out and the big guys have the say. But there's an explicit statement from AOSIS. This is the first time that we've been listened to at the COP. So I think you've had that, and I think that the church has contributed to that through the work that they have been doing. I looked at the various declarations, before the Paris Agreement, from the various faith groups, and there are many, many religions who have put in declarations, and you can pull out from those some common ground, and I'd summarise it all by our own concept of kaitiakitanga, expressed in different ways, but the concept of stewardship of the natural environment is one that's very strong and common across different faiths. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, you actually can see some of that reflected. It's, for example, noting the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems. It's really what we're saying. And the South Americans, Latin Americans, have the concept of Mother Earth or Pachamama, which has got an explicit mention in here, as has an explicit mention of the concept of climate justice, which has been a very strong theme of church declarations on climate change. So I think some satisfaction can be taken from that aspect of churches' plural work. They are well in touch with these, as I said, with the more vulnerable sectors of society and the more vulnerable countries amongst in the world. And Matheson talked about some of the initiatives that the church has, both in the Pacific, practical things that are being done, for example, disinvestment, as an example, I guess, of sort of practicing what you're preaching. Now coming on to what is the appropriate role, or where's the most useful role for church from now on, and what I think is this new context. And as I say, I do think that for New Zealand, and it's in there in the Paris Agreement, the main challenge for us is, by 2020, we're invited to come up with what is effectively our long-term transition plan. It's got weasel words around it because it wasn't very palatable for OPEC and other countries who are based on fossil fuels, their economy is based on fossil fuels, but we've got some time to think about how New Zealand does that transition, and some of the work that the Minister has started is good. So, what's the most effective role of the Church? I think that the time for declarations is perhaps past. Declarations and the associated, moral righteousness, they have been influential, but I see now diminishing returns from that sort of approach. Declarations come easy, and especially if you're telling other people what they should do. So, what would be maybe a more effective way now, given if I'm right about the context, what would be a more effective way of trying that? Well, I would say one thing at home would be helping to shape that transition. Very important. There are issues of social justice there. There are distributional effects. I mean, if you presume a very high price on carbon, how does that flow through into electricity prices? Is that just that poor people have a much higher burden on electricity? Who should bear the burden? Do we continue to allow agriculture to be excluded from most carbon pricing? Is that right? And another aspect which has been not very well dealt with at all, but is in the Paris Agreement too, is this concept of just transition. It's a little bit of a code word that it comes out of the union movement, but you have this concern. If you want your country to play its part and do this big shift, then there's a lot of people going to be concerned about their jobs. So what do you do? What about people who are working in the fossil fuel industries or fossil fuel dependent industries? What are they supposed to do? So there's where you get to the concept of the just transition, and I would see the engagement in that area, discussions with government, with business on that concept. Don't forget about those people whose jobs will be under threat because of climate change or because of the action that's taken on climate change. I think that social justice, just transition, dealing with the potential losers and giving them a voice is really important. And that's something that I think we will be seeing sector by sector. Clearly too, the engagement with the South Pacific will be very important still, and I think that my observation is that for the island states of the South Pacific, like other small island states, the problem is that this UN machinery is just so massive and so bureaucratic that it's actually quite hard to get easy, efficient access to the resources that are there. You've got massive bureaucratic hurdles when what you really have is some quite direct and relatively easily met practical needs. But there are if you're obliged to go by this awful UN bureaucracy, it's terribly time consuming, and for countries who have very few officials who have enough time and expertise to deal with it. So there I think is the role. I think New Zealand is already doing. I know Murray McCully is really keen on the renewable energy ideas, but I think getting practical involvement with the South Pacific on what the actual needs are, especially on the adaptation side, if you like, and how New Zealand can help, that also will be helpful. I'm not sure that trying to take a stab at what our targets should be and when is necessarily all that helpful. But just one aspect that just occurred to me in terms of engagement. I'm trying to sort of suggest a shift, if you like, from declarations to engagement. Just recently, the Morgan Foundation pointed out that several major New Zealand companies had met their obligations under the emissions trading scheme by purchasing effectively worthless hot air, 20 cents a tonne. Why wouldn't you, if it would cost you $15 a tonne to buy good quality credits? Now, the companies pointed out quite rightly they'd done nothing illegal. The emissions trading scheme was set up to allow them to meet their obligations at least cost, and they were allowed full access to international markets, and these units were washing around in the international markets. Most other countries didn't allow their use, but New Zealand did, so of course the accountants would say, sure, you buy the cheap stuff, and we'll be fine, we'll meet our obligations. Now, it's interesting that none of those companies seems to have seen any reputational risk in buying those, I used to call them junk credits, buying the hot air. So, is there a role? Now you talked about as a disinvestment from fossil fuels. That's fine, but I mean, I'd also argue as a counter to that, there is a role of fossil fuels in the transition, and especially gas as a transition fuel from coal to renewables. But okay, is anyone dialoguing with these companies? Z Energy, they portray themselves as very responsible. They've got e-vehicle charging stations in their forecourts. Fonterra, clean green food to the world. I mean, this is potentially, there's some potential here, I think, for some engagement in from what you are expert at, and saying, hey, is this something that you think is what do you think about, how does that square with your corporate philosophy in Fonterra's case, clean, green, healthy food, etc. So I think there are definitely ways, and I think it's the challenge now is it's harder. It's an awful lot harder now to get engaged on the transition or some of these points that I made, the just transition, how you deal with the workers. It's a lot harder, but I think it would be my sense now that the time has come to shift towards that, so you can actually so much more likely to become so much more effective. And similarly, building on in terms of the South Pacific, New Zealand and the South Pacific, I think building on that practical side that's already there, but you've got a greater weight now because you do have a New Zealand government that sort of gets it like everybody else. You've got New Zealand business stepping up, maybe not yet 100%, but the Sustainable Business Council is doing quite useful work. And finally, I've got the role at the moment of looking at whether we can set up what we might call a climate forum, a little bit along the lines of the Land and Water Forum, but very different, I think, in some respects. The idea there is to have a sort of multi-stakeholder forum that can be a place where you can actually talk about these issues as they're coming through from the work done in the different sectors. And it's interesting that both Labour and the Greens, if you've noticed, they've been putting out the odd olive branch to government, talking about how useful it would be if we had some cross-party cooperation as well. So if something like a forum would be something that the politicians were comfortable with and the various stakeholders were, that's something where I think we could see an obvious case for some involvement by the church. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to go. We'll probably have a decision in the next few weeks ago. So I'm ending on an optimistic note because I think, as I say, the context has changed internationally, the context has changed in New Zealand, and this has led to opportunities, I think, for much less frustrating engagement with government and others, and maybe a sense that we can get onto something more concrete now, and more of a sense of direction. So that would be my take on the role of the church in the coming decade or so, 5 years or so.